Good evening and welcome to our St. Paul Learn with the League. The Learn with the League program is a series of educational and informative programs that is part of the League of Women Voters of St. Paul's programming for our community. This is the second of the 2022 programs that the St. Paul League will be presenting. Tonight's programming is Minnesota Redistricting Update. What's done and what's left to do. We are excited to be offering this presentation on a topic that is a core issue for the League of Women Voters nationwide. We have events such as this about 8 times each year. As always, you can view past programs on our YouTube channel. Hello, I am Pamela Mercier, a member of the Programming Committee of the League of Women Voters of St. Paul. For over 100 years, the League of Women Voters has worked as a citizens league to improve our government and engage all citizens in decisions that affect our lives. The League is a nonpartisan membership organization dedicated to you, our community. We join the efforts of 800 state and local leagues to bring bipartisan, nonpartisan political advocacy, education, and empowerment to the local level. Check out our website to learn more about membership in the League. We welcome new members throughout the year. Our program is supported additionally tonight by the League of Women Voters in the Roseville area and the League of Women Voters in the White Bear Lake area. We are also supported by the Suburban Community Channels and the St. Paul Neighborhood Network. We'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are learning today on the ancestral homelands of the Dakota, Minnesota, and the current home of many Native nations, including many Dakota and Ojibwa. The program tonight is being recorded and broadcast on Facebook Live. Toward the end of the program, our panelists will take questions from the audience. Please use the Zoom Q&A bubble at the bottom of the screen. If you are watching on Facebook Live, please put your questions in the comment section. Also, we are using the new Zoom closed caption feature. These are auto-generated, and so they might not be exact. This year's election calendar is on the screen. We have our primary here on August 9th, and the general election is November 8th. Look for League candidate forums and League voter guides from your local leagues. We're here to help you make informed voting decisions. Tonight's presentation on the Minnesota redistricting process will cover information about what redistricting is and where we are in that process today. As many of you know, the redistricting process occurs every 10 years as a result of the federal census. The current redistricting process is using information gathered from the 2020 census. In all 50 states, various bodies redraw their state legislative districts. If you look at the League of Women Voters Minnesota website, you can learn that redistricting reform is named as a core issue of the League, a key part of the League's mission. The League explains its commitment to redistricting reform in 3 salient statements about the goals of reform. Let's take a second to look at these. There are 3 goals, and later the 3 goals are: first, that every vote should count equally. The second one is that elections should be determined by voters, not politicians. And the third one is about making the process open and honest and to protect our fundamental right to vote. We are pleased to have with us tonight the redistricting coordinator for the League of Women Voters Minnesota, Mr. Paul Huffman. Paul will share with us where we are in the redistricting process and what still needs to be done to help ensure that the redistricting results meet the goals defined by the League of Women Voters and others. Previously, in our March 2021 program, Paul talked with us about the redistricting process in Minnesota as it was getting underway. Now he's here to update us as the legislature has completed its work. He will let us know if the goals of reform have been achieved as the redistricting maps have been finished and have been distributed, and they were actually created by a panel of judges, and he will explain that to you as well. I also wish to point out that the League has implemented 2 programs aimed at bringing about redistricting reforms. One is called Our Maps Minnesota, and the other is Fair Map. You can see these on the screen. Both of these focus on creating fair political maps through education, advocacy, and more, and Paul has been deeply involved in these efforts. Before Paul begins his presentation, I would like to share with you some interesting details about his background as a vital member of the League of Women Voters Minnesota and as a person with rich career history. So let's just take a look. Paul works with national and state organizations to support the Minnesota League members and community groups to encourage participation in redistricting. He's also a member of our MAPS Redistricting Campaign Steering Committee and a member of the Board of Directors of the League of Women Voters Minnesota. He has a post-baccalaureate certificate in election administration from the Humphrey School. And he served in the Navy as a nuclear submarine officer, retiring from Xcel Energy in 2019 as general manager of its nuclear fleet operations. So, welcome, Paul. And we'd like to invite you to share your presentation with us when you are ready. Afterwards, I will come back on and we'll share some questions with you. Thank you, Paul.
Great, thank you, Pam. And thank you to the League of Women Voters St. Paul for this opportunity for hosting this program. You know, as Pam said, this is a very important point in our redistricting process. We are at a point where the state maps have been issued that we're making a pivot to local redistricting. It's something that has been in reality in play for a while, but it really has come to the head right now. So, and Pam, as Pam talked, she laid a great groundwork for when redistricting happens and how that occurs after the census every 10 years. So the maps that are getting updated or replaced at this point have been in place for the last 10 years. So as you can imagine, there's been changes in demographics, changes in population, and we'll talk about some of that. And so that requires updating. And so there's a number of things legally that have to be considered, both at a state level, at a federal level, and then locally. So we'll take the time to go through all of that. One of the things I always preface these conversations with is that the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization. We don't support or oppose candidates or political parties at any level of government. At the same time, we are always working on vital issues of concern to our members and the public. And so we do deal in things that are political, but yet we strive to be nonpartisan. And by that, we don't favor one party's perspective or policy over another. We may find that our positions may align with one party or another at some point in time, but that is purely happenstance by where those parties align. Over time, both parties have been responsible for policies we have agreed with, things like a vote by mail, where both Republican and Democratic states historically have implemented that, and have opposed parties that do things, and even today, in areas such as gerrymandering that undermines our democratic processes and really robs people of their opportunity to elect their chosen officials and have their policy preferences heard and addressed. So this is not something partisan, however, it does have political impact. The first thing I'm going to talk about briefly is the Minnesota congressional legislative maps. And I'll talk more about that. And Pam mentioned the legislature has a responsibility under Minnesota state constitution and statute to draw maps every 10 years after the census. The reality is this decade, just as the last four decades, the legislature could not agree on maps that the governor would then sign. In this decade, just as in 2010, as in 2002, the legislature could not agree on maps. In some previous cycles, 1992 and 1982, the legislature might agree, but then the governor doesn't agree. So we continue to have this situation where the process as written doesn't work, which probably is the best situation given our structure. And then the courts draw the maps. What happened in the legislature this last year, the DFL published maps in the House in November, and they updated those in December and approved those and sent those to the floor of the Minnesota House. The GOP submitted congressional legislative maps in December, and there was actually, I think in January, a Republican map introduced in the Senate, in order to get that on the table. And that was that there at the bottom. So there were maps presented in both the House and the Senate. None of those got a hearing in the overall Senate or House, and therefore the time ran out as we expected, and so it was up to the courts. One of the things I want to say is the first bullet here is no change in existing statutes. Much broader discussion, but there's very little in the way of state law about how redistricting is done. It is a very open process. Whatever the court did to support redistricting this cycle or previous cycles is not binding on the legislature and the governor. So if either party had control of redistricting, as happens in many states, then those past judicial practices would be of no protection to the people of Minnesota. The timeline, basically first lawsuit last February, that was by Peter Watson, who many of you may have heard of, Peter being a former state Senate consul. In June, the Supreme Court Chief Justice appointed a redistricting panel of 5 active judges with geographic, gender, racial, and partisan diversity. So a very balanced group of judges. In October, there were hearings for our public testimony. In November, the panel adopted redistricting principles. In December, the parties submitted their maps, and I'll talk about who the parties were to that lawsuit. They made arguments in January, and on February 15th, which is the date required based on statute, it has to be 25 weeks prior to the primaries in August that Pam mentioned, the maps were required to be issued. And that was a law passed by the legislature in 1992 to ensure there's adequate time for election officials to provide an opportunity for candidates to apply for candidacy, for primaries to be held and ballots to be made, and so on. So that date had to be done to meet the state law. Since the legislature failed to do its job, the Supreme Court did that for them. The parties to the litigation, the first is a Secretary of State. The Secretary of State is responsible for implementation of election law in Minnesota. Redistricting is part of election law because it governs who people will vote for. So then he was the defendant in this case. There were plaintiffs. Peter Watson included Peter, Joe Mansky, who at one time worked in elections in Ramsey County and for the state of Minnesota. Other Minnesota voters and the League of Women Voters Minnesota. We became a co-plaintiff in August of last year to that. And we felt that that was strategically the best way to represent our members and voters in Minnesota in a way that we thought would be influential in the maps. There's a group called the Sachs Plaintiffs, and that's a group of DFL voters from Minnesota, represented by, oh gosh, the name just escaped me, but anyway, based on the very famous Democratic, redistricting attorney who runs a lot of these cases. There's the Anderson Plaintiffs. That is a similar group of Republican voters from Minnesota, supported by the Republican Party. Then there's another group, the Corey plaintiffs. The Corey plaintiffs were a group of minority BIPOC communities and community groups and individuals who wanted to make the maps take a whole new look, basically a fresh look at maps, clean sheet of paper, and really coming from the perspectives of minority communities. And one of the things driving this, and one of the things driving the maps that were done by the courts, was that much of the population growth and the reason we retained our 8th congressional district had to do with the growth in non-white communities in Minnesota through the census. So it was important for those voices to be raised. They brought a very important perspective to the litigation. That work that they brought, the maps, was a result of the efforts by the Our Maps Minnesota campaign, which the league supported in mapping activities for them to bring those products and then develop their own maps. I mentioned that the court adopted redistricting principles, and there's a lot to that. Some things I want to make clear is that when the court drew the maps, there's some things that are legally required, and there's things that aren't. And the court was really clear that their principles were not listed in priority order, but their language really made clear that there were some things that were more important than others that would be considered before others. The first several things on the list are things required by constitutional law or by federal law, equalizing population, protecting equal opportunity, really going back to the 14th and 15th Amendments, as well as the Voting Rights Act. And then a couple next are those that are required by state law or are highly preferred. Preservation of reservation lands was very high. That's never been a specific principle stated by the court in the past. Convenient contiguous territories, a constitutional requirement in Minnesota. Communities of interest is one that has been used, but it got modified significantly by the court to not include political interests. That is very important because political interests are inherent in the interests of the political parties. That is not something that's unique to a community, can't be geographically defined in the isolation for other cultural, economic, or social interests. Compactness is something that's been historically kept with convenient contiguous. Compactness is not a legal requirement in Minnesota. It's preferred by some folks. It can be used as a surrogate for gerrymandering if something is highly non-compact and irregular, but that's not a legal requirement, and also can stand in the way of reflecting communities of interest. And then the last two things here are very important. The court took a much stronger stand on not looking at incumbents where they live, and on being clear that they don't have the purpose of protecting, promoting, or defeating incumbents. That resulted in many more incumbents being paired than historically in the legislature. So that's something very important to understand. So that was a real departure from the past. For the courts, at least, this will stand as a starting point for the future, and we think that is a very, very positive step for the people of Minnesota. So all of these groups provided maps, and so there's a lot of ways to look at it. There was an excellent program led by Nick Harper earlier this afternoon that will be posted as a blog post on the League of Voters Minnesota page, where he goes through maps, and I know a number of groups are doing this as well. But from a objective standpoint, one of the things you can do is look at some metrics and determine how the different people who submitted maps, what did those look like? And partisan lean is something, this all comes from the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, their analysis of the maps submitted. And you look at partisan lean as the degree to which the map would favor one party over another compared to historical performance. So if it was a zero lean, that would imply that their maps are aligned with historical partisan choice. The reality is in places like Minnesota, there is some element to which there is a inherent partisan lean. because Democratic voters tend to concentrate in urban areas, which are harder to tease out and distribute without going through cracking and dividing communities of interest. And Republican voters tend to be much more dispersed in rural areas, exurban and suburban areas. So there's some built-in lean that can be eliminated through how districts are drawn. But when you see no lean or a Democratic lean in a state like Minnesota, that implies a map that's been written to a specific policy benefit, if you will. A strong lean in the other direction would mean potentially a Republican benefit. So what you see here is the Republican maps have a strong Republican lean, but the Watson map did also, as did the Court map. And so you see that most of those maps are drawn basically based on what the Princeton Gerrymandering Project saw as a 4 Democrat, 4 Republican split. But you look, the number of competitive seats varies. And yet there would be 2 competitive congressional seats, those being District 2 and District 8 potentially. And then the county splits, and that just shows you how they preserve geographic areas. One thing that I'll mention, and with anything on metrics, you got to take that with a little grain of salt, is that you got to look at how they define those numbers. And here's a famous British Prime Minister once said, lies, damn lies, and statistics. So, you know, you can look at the numbers. These Princeton Gerrymandering Project uses the last statewide elections and the last senatorial elections as their basis for partisan lean. In Minnesota, that was 2018 and 2020, both elections with very strong DFL turnout. So that would imply to me, my personal opinion, that this has a little bit of a Democratic favoritism to it from a lean standpoint. So if you say it's a 12.5% Republican lean or a 4-4 map, that may be actually not reflecting more favorably on the DFL than is real in a historical basis. So my personal opinion on the Court map is it's more like a 4-3-1 map, 4 Republican, 4 Democrat, 4 Republican, 3 Democrat, and 1 toss-up being District 2. So, you know, understand that we get those numbers. So again, take those a little grain of salt, and that things shift over time. Here's the Senate districts. Again, a lot less of a lean, but again, bigger lean when you look at the Republicans toward the Republican side, less lean on the Democratic side. The courts tend to be a little more in the middle. Pretty much all of those tend to, you know, 37 to 39 Democratic seats in the Senate, with the exception of the House, the Republicans, which came to 35. So again, based on the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. Now that's, you know, when we talked about the uncertainty is in that, and then the number of competitive seats. What this all means is that with that many competitive seats, the majority in either chamber is open to being turned at any given point in time. And last thing I'll mention, the House, you see there the 0 lean on the DFL maps that were submitted, you know, being something to be aware of. The fairly positive Republican lean 5.2 and 4.5 in those 2 Republican maps, and the Court nearer to where the Watson plaintiffs were. So again, you know, how that plays out. So these slides will be made available to everybody through the St. Paul League, and you can look at those, and there's also resources to help you find the website yourself. You can go look at these on a Princeton Gerrymandering Project yourself. Some insights from the Court map, and you know, they use the least case approach, you know, least change approach, excuse me, and that's what courts historically do. The northern Minnesota Native American tribal areas were reunited in 1 district, CD8. That was one of the things that was a priority for the league and our co-plaintiffs, was to do that. Also, it was for the Corey plaintiffs. And so that was something we felt very strongly about. There's also, most of those areas are 1 state Senate district. Now, it's not a majority minority district, but it's I think about 30% Native American in that district up around Bemidji. So that's a real shift that provides an opportunity for the voices of those communities to be heard. Congressional District 8 extended in North Metro. That's actually something the DFL party wanted, kind of trying to dilute the strong rural flavor of that district. The districts in Rochester were changed so that's historically the city of Rochester was really split in half between two Senate districts, which were very marginally Republican. That's been changed. The BIPOC community tends to live in the northeastern 2/3 of Rochester. Most of that is now in a single Senate district, but now it trends much more Democratic. The other district, more rural, trends more Republican. So that's probably going to result in more effective representation where the rural voices get their voice, the more urban and minority BIPOC voices get their voices heard. So probably better representation, a better product by the court. There's a lot of minority opportunity districts created. The number I've heard from the courts is 22 House districts and 7 Senate minority opportunity districts. So the court really, more than almost anybody, took a step toward establishing opportunities for minority representation. One of the things that, and I talked about the perennial incumbents, one of the things that's subtle, but it's going to take a time for you to get used to is the legislative districts were renumbered for a long time. The districts are numbered around the state, and it came back to the metro, which resulted in really a situation that took some getting used to. So people are going to have to look and understand what district am I in. It may be pretty close to the same one, but the number may be very different. I used to be in Senate District 53. I'm now in Senate District 47. So it's just a little bit different. And the last thing I'll mention is that my view, and I think the data bears this out, is that the congressional Senate maps are probably more favorable to Republicans. Republicans have overall said that they think the maps are good. When either party says we think the maps are good, you got to think that they really like the maps. The DFL has said nothing about the maps, which means they're probably not quite as happy as the Republicans are. In either case, the court, by drawing least change maps, they start with something that's got a certain cast to it, being primarily oriented to rural areas, and it limits the amount of change that really can occur. So based on that, what I want to do is stop briefly and see if there's questions on the state and court maps before I keep going. We'll have more opportunity for questions at the end. And I don't see anything in the chat. So hearing nothing, we'll go on to local redistricting. And I mentioned earlier that this really kicks off finalizing local redistricting. I want to talk about kind of what's been going on, or in some places, maybe not everywhere, and then what is coming. What's been happening is that city and county governments, for many of them, have been determining local redistricting process, assembling data, getting information ready for decision makers, county commissioners, city councils, charter commissions, to finalize that local redistricting. Those governments have had census data available since August or September. They've had all the documents from the Secretary of State's office. They've had all kinds of data. So there's been opportunities, and there's a great video from the League of Minnesota Cities where Little Falls city manager, and that's a city of about 9,100 people. He's been looking since October at his district, his wards and precincts in Little Falls up in Morrison County. They straddle the Mississippi River, so it makes their situation a lot more complicated. So they've been working on this for months. And so, like I tell people, Little Falls can do this. Then big cities like St. Paul and Rochester and other places, they can do the same thing. There's a wide variation approach to public involvement, with really most municipalities, counties, and cities having very little transparency, very little communication, no opportunity for public input or involvement. And unfortunately, I think St. Paul is a bit in that camp. And I'll talk about it here in a moment. So, so that's something that immediately should jump out at you as an opportunity: is how do we participate in this process that is so important to determining our representation and whose voices are heard and who is representing us. Some have been pretty noteworthy in collecting input. Washington County, Olmsted County, Ramsey County has been good. Ramsey County, I was looking today, and they've got a website. They've got ways to make input. Minneapolis, Brooklyn Park, and Rochester, from a city standpoint, have been getting input. So that's what's been going on, and that's all. And some of them have frankly been drawn draft maps. I know Little Falls has draft maps because they showed people back in November what they were looking at in order to accommodate their population shifts and their precinct changes. So what's happening now? Well, we mentioned the courts approved the maps, and all those jurisdictions that said we can't do anything until the legislative and congressional maps are drawn, which is not totally accurate, by the way, but that is now off the table. Now the cities and the counties can finalize their maps. The first thing that has to happen is cities and counties update precinct boundaries, because you cannot divide a legislative or congressional district within a precinct. So if you go to a precinct to vote, like you're in, St. Paul, Ward 1, Precinct 7, you're only going to see one congressional district and one legislative district on your ballot in that precinct. You may see different other races in that precinct. I know in Washington County, where I am, you can go to a precinct and see 2 and even 3 different school boards in that precinct, but you will not see more than one congressional district. You will not see more than one legislative district on a ballot or on all of the ballots in that precinct. So you got to do that. Now, cities normally do that, the change of precinct boundaries, in conjunction with the drawing of ward boundaries, because your city boundaries and ward boundaries have to follow precinct boundaries. So it only makes sense to do those things together. So the cities are doing that, or should be doing that right now. In St. Paul, the drawing of precinct boundaries has been contracted to Ramsey County, but Ramsey County now has to work hand in glove with the city of St. Paul, in which case it's the Charter Commission. And then there needs to be hearings. Now, ideally, there'll be listening sessions on redistricting locally to provide people an opportunity to provide input on what they like or don't like about their maps, or what they'd like to see in their new maps, what community they are part of that they would like to have kept together, whether you're in the Frogtown neighborhood of St. Paul, or you're in Lower Town, or wherever you are in St. Paul. If you say, this is the area in which we live, we'd like that all to be kept in one ward, then that's your opportunity. Or if you want to keep that in one commissioner district in the county, those are your opportunity. So then they'll do that, they'll finalize the maps, and the due dates for maps, March 29th for the city, April 26th for the county. So that's coming up very quickly, just over a month, about 5 weeks from today is the city. And then about another 4 weeks later, 9 weeks from now, is the county. So, not much time, very quick process. Again, something for accountability for your local governments is they could have been doing a lot of this stuff previously, but for whatever reason, they haven't been. Now, Ramsey County has been doing some, and you're likely not aware of it, but they have, and I'll talk about that. So that's where we are and what's happening now. It's time now to make your voices heard, to find out what's going on. In St. Paul, with the ward redistricting, the Charter Commission is responsible. And every city with wards is a home rule charter city and has a city charter. The city charter is what defines who draws the map, whether it's the city council or whether it's the Charter Commission. In most cities, it's the city council. In St. Paul, just like in Minneapolis, Brooklyn Park, and White Bear Lake, it is the Charter Commission. Now, that's a plus and a minus. The Charter Commission is not elected, so they don't have the political self-interest in where those maps are drawn. The flip side is the Charter Commission tends to be pretty opaque. They're off the radar. They don't have much visibility. There's not a lot of publicity around what their activities are. I was doing a program for White Bear Lake in November of last year. I think it was November. And I found out that the night before our program, the Charter Commission in White Bear Lake had a meeting on redistricting. So it would have been really nice to have known that. The Charter Commission did have a hearing last week in St. Paul on redistricting, and they got another one coming up this week I'll talk about. So you've got an opportunity to get involved. One of the things that's a real positive for St. Paul, the city council in October 2020 pass a resolution for redistricting principles. I provided that information to the league leadership. They can provide that to their members and the community at large, because those principles, tells you what the elected officials in St. Paul expect by way of the Charter Commission. The Charter Commission is independent, so they kind of have their own rights to make decisions, but they should be taken into account. And that's something that you could reach out to the Charter Commission and make sure they understand. You expect them to listen to those, the city council, and respect those principles. A really important one, two important ones there. One is the recognition and preservation of communities of interest. That's really important. Notice the court used that for the state. Another one is, and this is really interesting, I was telling Heidi and Pam and others before this, that there's a provision in that resolution from the city council saying the map should be drawn de novo, meaning without regard for existing ward boundaries, kind of a clean sheet of paper from new. So rather than what most elected bodies do, and the court does, which is they try to make the minimum change to equalize population, your city council said, no, we expect you to step back, look at the whole of St. Paul and determine what's the best for the residents of St. Paul to draw those maps. So that provides a real unique opportunity to take a fresh look at where your communities are and how best you would be represented by your city officials. So just something I would advocate to you. And again, the leadership of the league has that to share. And you can find that online. Takes a little searching, but we'll help you find that and have that in your hand so you can hold both the Charter Commission and the elected officials accountable to that. I mentioned there's a Charter Commission hearing this Thursday at 3 p.m. It's in person, not ideal. One of the things you could propose is, have these meetings in the evening, make them virtual, so you have opportunities for others in the community without regards for when they work and their concerns for some, public gatherings to participate. That meeting and talking to an administrative resource for the Charter Commission today, that meeting is really more about talking about process. So you've got an opportunity to say, here's what you want them to listen to and consider as part of that hearing. You can contact them directly. That is the Charter Commission's email, chartercommission@stpaul.gov. I don't know that you'll find that on the website because I couldn't find it, but here you go. If you want to contact the Charter Commission, the people that are going to draw your award maps, there's your contact. So that's for you. Understand they'll probably get 3 weeks notice on hearing. So you really will have a week or so to make some input on how they're going to draw those draft maps to be reviewed and presented to the public. For the Ramsey County, they have a website, has opportunity for public input, comment, to submit maps. They've had a couple of informational sessions, last week, which is great, but that's in the past. I don't know how many people were aware of that. They don't currently have additional hearings or meetings scheduled. That doesn't mean they won't, they just don't have them scheduled on their website yet. Those reserved commissioner districts are due April 26th, as I mentioned. So there's been some background where the county has been more open and maybe more ahead of the game. I don't know if I'd say your Charter Commission hasn't been open. I think the Charter Commission just is behind. And so that's going to create greater urgency and greater limitations and ability for public input and participation in that process. So that's something to bear in mind, is that the county has had some performance there that's positive. So encourage and reinforce that. Populations, one of the things I did when I went through, if you look at existing populations in the county, where they are and what the existing commissioner districts, the numbers in black means those districts are over the ideal population of 78,000. The ones where it's negative, red means they're under. The ones that are under have to get bigger. So District 1, where Commissioner Fretham is got to get bigger. It's going to have to take some area out of District 7 and District 2. And then that means that District 3 and 4, which are both under, they have to get bigger. And then they're going to take areas out of District 6 and 5. So, from a least change approach, that's how that would work. Again, the least change approach is what is what the elected officials typically use. That is not what's being requested by the St. Paul City Council. And this just gives you numbers and percentages. There's only one of those that's over 5%. The legal requirement is for both for county commission districts and for city council wards to be as close to equal as possible. And city councils or elected officials will tell you, well, I don't want to split a precinct or change precincts. I'll give you the example of Afton, Minnesota. Little Afton has 4 wards, and each ward is a precinct. And so if you do the math, each ward is like 350 people. They are able to get that population difference down within 2%. That's within 20 people. So they're taking advantage of a lot of mapping ability to change the ward and precinct boundaries in the city of Afton. So again, if the Little Afton can do it, then St. Paul and Ramsey County can do it. They can make those numbers as equal as possible. So, and a lot more equal than 1% potentially. If you look at it, they want to stick with the existing precincts. That's going to limit their ability to do that. So again, an opportunity to advocate for equalizing districts where it makes sense to preserve communities of interest and community interest. This is St. Paul wards. It gives you a sense of where that is. Again, those black areas, and we see this throughout the state, is that urban areas, we see the growth in population greater on the periphery. And St. Paul is constrained by the Mississippi River, kind of the south and west, by Minneapolis to the west, and then by other cities to the north. Then you look at the east, it's a little less developed, if you will. So that's where there's more growth in that eastern part of St. Paul, and that's reflected in those numbers. Again, if it's got a black positive number, that means those wards have to get smaller. The reds have to get bigger. But again, look at what makes sense for the people and don't be constrained by existing ward boundaries. And this thing gives you a sense of that variation between the wards that exist. So again, you'll get these slides that will be available to you so that you can dig into those numbers yourself. If you're going to provide input on maps, a couple of things to consider. And this comes from the Brennan Center for Justice, who's done a lot of work on democracy, election, and redistricting issues. They had a study done on the 2010 to 12 redistricting cycle on what worked when people were making comments on redistricting. And this is really helpful. And first is provide actionable instructions. Saying something like make it better, make it more fair, that's really not helpful to somebody who's making a decision. If you say, I want to preserve this 6-block area and in a ward or in a commissioner district because we all share similar cultural, economic, or social interests, that is something that is implementable. That's something that can be done with. In the state mapping testimony to the court, there were people who testified that, for example, in southeast Minnesota, that area along the Mississippi River going all the way from the southern border all the way up to places like Red Wing and Goodhue County, that had a specific common interest as lake country, certain soils that were common. And actually the court took some of that and shaped a district, while it still goes all the way out to the western border, that did increase more along that Mississippi River boundary, which then pushed District 2 a little bit further out to the west. So District 1 goes further up, it goes all the way up the Red Wing, and that more rural area. So think something actionable. Think small. The smaller the area, the more easily actionable, especially when we're talking cities and counties. Be smaller, more focused, more specific. Define your community. More important than drawing a map is being able to articulate why that map matters, why it's important, why the map being drawn a certain way is important to a significant group of people that can be recognized. So, and the passion and the commitment is more important than any amount of numbers you can throw at these things. Maps created with online mapping programs can help, but the maps are only beneficial, or I would say most beneficial, if you have testimony that can go along with that about why that map matters, why it's important, coming from residents, constituents of that area. Generally, you only have limited time, 3 minutes to 5 minutes. So you have to really be focused, get your talking points down. The last thing I would say is build neighborhood coalitions, get others to work with you on that. So the recommended actions: contact your local government staff to ask for how to provide comments and proposed maps. If you're not finding a website, reach out and contact them. Understand, and I was telling Heidi earlier, I was surprised at how poor the St. Paul City website was on how to provide input or ask a question even to the city. And I provided feedback to the staff at the city on that, because I talked to a lot of cities, I look at a lot of websites, and I was surprised, frankly. I didn't expect that. But you may have to call somebody, you may have to persist a little bit to get that information. But that gives you other insights about how your local government works. Contact the elected officials to let them know what you expect about public input, participation, transparency. Let them know what you expect. There's no guarantee they'll do that, but I guarantee if you don't ask, they won't do it. So you can only get improvement if you make your voices heard and you become known and you get more responsiveness from your elected officials. Provide input to your county commissioner and charter commission in St. Paul on how you want your map to be drawn. That's that specific input on the maps. The last thing I'll mention is educate others, because none of us, there's, those who are on right now, those who view this program later, we are not going to be enough by ourselves to make the changes that are needed. At the same time, I'll tell you is few enough people provide input on maps that it only takes 3 or 4 people to have a meaningful impact, and the conversation is heard by the charter commissioner or county commissioners. So it doesn't take an army, it takes 3 or 4 knowledgeable, committed, passionate people to make a significant difference in the perception of those people who are making the decisions. So I really encourage you to do that. So that's the things you can do, and we're here to help at the League of Women Voters with that. When I transition now to just kind of early trends in national redistricting, what's going on, and what we're seeing is what we expected to see after the Rocha v. Common Cause. That was the Supreme Court case in 2019 that said that the federal courts had no place in partisan gerrymandering. So it basically said, okay, it's open field day on partisan gerrymandering, unless you're constrained by your state courts, which in most of those states has not happened. So where you get states with single party control, aggressive gerrymandering, even more aggressive than previously. North Carolina, for example, the legislature is gerrymandered. And so they just increased the gerrymander, and the governor can't veto it. So even having split government in someplace like North Carolina doesn't do any good. But unfortunately, North Carolina, their state constitution and their courts are disposed to provide some protection. So those maps have been rejected and are getting redrawn. Oregon, the legislature initially drew a map with 6 Democratic seats. They gained a seat. They drew them all for the Democrats. The Republicans walked out, causing a loss of quorum. And so then the Democrats made one Republican leading seat, so they passed it. In Kentucky, and this is what happens with gerrymandered maps, is they have a supermajority of Republicans in Kentucky. So even though they have a split government, the gerrymandered legislature overrode the Democratic veto to even more gerrymandered maps. So, and I'll come to that impact here in a moment. Maryland, the Democratic gerrymandered legislature overrode the Republican veto. So this is not one party or the other. It's both parties. They both do it. One party happens to be more effective, but they both do it when given the opportunity. In Alabama, the maps were rejected by the federal court as racial gerrymander. That stay was lifted by the U.S. Supreme Court. That is a whole nother conversation about voting rights and the protections of the Voting Rights Act in the Supreme Court. But, there is a continued growth in population, and Alabama has been in minority communities. What they did was they packed all the minorities in a single congressional district. They've been packed for decades. And the Supreme Court said they've always been packed, so it's okay. It's not a change. That I think we all agree that probably doesn't make it okay, but that's just the reality. We have divided government. no agreement, the courts decide. So Minnesota, just like it has for the last 50 years, the courts decided. Wisconsin gerrymandered 10 years ago because they had a Republican legislature and governor. They're going to take a least change approach to the maps, which means they're going to be gerrymandered for another 10 years. The impacts of what we have in Maryland, Kentucky, Wisconsin means that once you're gerrymandered, you're stuck for decades, unless you have courts and a state constitution that are disposed to prevent partisan gerrymandering. And that is just not the condition that exists in most of this country, and it does not exist in our federal courts at this point. So that's why for a later discussion, you'll hear me talking about this another, next year, is we've got to change the laws in Minnesota to change that. Political commissions or commissions, independent commissions, is a general term that people have used. And I've long maintained that there's a lot of flavors of commissions. And that's, again, a topic for another day. But there's political commissions, and then there's independent citizen commissions. There's 17 states with different kinds of commissions, advisory commissions or political commissions or political and citizen commissions. The reality is the only ones that really work are the independent citizen commissions, which there's only 4 of those: Arizona, California, Colorado, and Michigan. Those have been pretty uneventful. What's happened in the states with other kinds of commissions, advisory commissions or political commissions, is either gridlock, which has happened in Virginia, New York, and New York is going to turn into a Democratic gerrymander. They actually cut the number of Republican seats in New York in half, from 8 to 4. So they're going to offset the gerrymandering in Texas and Florida. So, that is kind of playing out. In Virginia, they implemented in 2018 a constitutional amendment for a political and citizen commission joint. The bottom line was the parties in both Virginia and New York said, there's nothing in it for me to agree. So I'm going to disagree. I'm going to sabotage the process. And in Virginia went to the courts. Ohio, they've got the kind of commission where the governor and the secretary of state also get a vote. So they gerrymandered Ohio even more, violated the words of the constitutional amendment from 2018 that the voters passed. The Supreme Court has thrown it out twice. They've thrown out the maps in Ohio. So we'll see where that goes. So what you see is increased partisan gridlock and obstruction. And this is basically, my view is, this is democratic weapons of mass destruction, where each party is using destructive democratic processes to their partisan benefit. And there's no incentive for either party not to do that, because then that constitutes basically unilateral disarmament, which then goes to the whole thing about HR1 and S1 and why we have to have a national solution to this. If the courts will not act and the parties won't restrain themselves, then we've got to have a national solution. Locally, and we talked about local tonight, one of the things is increasing focus on local redistricting. And I've been doing more research, and this has been going on for a while in places. It's becoming more visible, it's becoming more apparent, where county commissions in particular, because that's, if you think about it, that's where elections are controlled, that's where schools are controlled, that's where public health decisions are made, that's where public safety decisions are made. So there's a lot of energy around county commissions nationally. In New Mexico, county commissioners are splitting Native American reservations. In North Carolina, there's a commission near Winston-Salem that's being split or redistricted to potentially deprive a Black representative commissioner that's been in office for 20 years. In Texas, the Democratic majority in the Harris County Commission redistricted to go from a 3-2 Democratic to a 4-1 Democratic. Of course, the Texas courts wouldn't oppose that, because then they have to oppose the gerrymandering at the state level, and they're not going to do that. In Virginia, and this is why it's not just between parties, that's a very, very Democratic county board, and Prince George's County is a suburb of DC, but its moderates manipulate maps to reduce representation of more progressive liberal Democrats. So it's even within the Democratic Party. I would say we've seen this for decades in Minnesota, where rural versus urban interests, we see it in Olmsted County in particular. We hear it from Republicans at a state level about balancing rural and city interests. that is something that results in misrepresentation of voters because they are not being given that adequate, effective representation based on the populations and based on the people. So national trends, we need to be thinking about local redistricting and getting more aware and more involved in that. So where do we go from here? Briefly, we're working today to influence the development of state and local maps through litigation, which talk about advocacy, supporting community mobilization. And that includes the RMaps Minnesota campaign and working with other groups in Minnesota and our local leagues. The future is working toward legislation and constitutional amendment to reform redistricting in Minnesota. And that involves a lot around educating and engaging communities, about engaging the legislature, because unfortunately in Minnesota, we can't change anything without going through the legislature. So, and we got to do it before 2030, because if you think about the whole, revolver bit, at some point, there's going to be a round in the chamber. We're going to have a trifecta, and one party or other is going to gerrymander our legislature, our congressional districts. And then we're decades in recovering from that. So there's some reference material, a couple of things, the court maps. I talk about the Princess Gerrymandering Project and the local redistricting action kit for the league. This is where a lot of the materials that we have put together can be found, to help you. So just want to offer that and then open up for questions. And I apologize, we went a little bit long here, so we have a few minutes. But Pam, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Wow. What an astounding amount of information and important information to ponder. I'm going to look at the chat and see if there are a couple questions we could consider. And remember, everyone, you can also look this information up, this program on YouTube, and then some of the information will be available in other ways as well. Astoundingly important information, Paul. Let me see. So here's a question for you, Paul. It's kind of a general question. And this let's see. This person asked, was there any chatter on how fraught the census was this time? That is to say, the maps are only as accurate as the numbers given by the census, and this census had issues from the previous administration and the COVID pandemic. Can you comment on that?
That's a great question. I have not seen anything definitive on whether there was undercounting. We suspect, I'll just know because I was part of the Census Mobilization Partnership, working with the State Demographic Center and others and other community partners. And we suspected, based on anecdotal information, that we had undercounting, in particular of areas with multifamily housing, because of problems accessing those and how the Census Bureau approached those things. But there's nothing definitive, and I've not been able to hear anything that was able to definitively say that was or was not an issue. So we largely, there's really not much you can do about that once those numbers are official from the Census Bureau. So we took what we had and ran with it. I think there's a lot of lessons learned that we have and that we'll be talking about here in the years going forward.
Thank you. And here's another question. How do these upcoming changes affect the precinct caucuses that already selected delegates to May convention?
That's a great question. And a lot of these caucuses are going to have to re-caucus or whatever determine their process is. And this happens frequently, is that, and I had this question from some organizations prior to the maps coming out, is, well, what happens if we caucus and the map changes? Well, you re-caucus. I talked to some people, this was last year, that 10 years ago, their new Senate district didn't even have a caucus chair, because the caucus chair was now in a different district. So they had to find a new caucus chair. They had to run the caucus. They had to get a candidate. So, I'll tell you, the person that was going to run, at least I had heard was going to run for the state Senate in my district, may actually now be in a different Senate district. So that's a question that each one of the parties has to address in those areas. If they've got a candidate who is an incumbent, who can run for that office, then they don't need to caucus.
Oh my goodness. Well, I think in the interest of time, I think let me check here. Other questions? New message. Yeah, we're just wondering if there's anything in summary you would like to say to us. Make sure that we walk away with before we finish up here, Paul. And of course, again, people have ample opportunity to look at all this wonderful, important information you've shared with us.
Yeah, the one thing I would say to walk away with is that get involved with your local government. What are they doing redistricting? The behaviors around redistricting, transparency, openness, public involvement, that carries over to lots of other things. Getting to know your elected representatives or charter commission in St. Paul, that has added dividends, and it grows kind of the understanding of government. There's a huge civic education component. So I think local redistricting is a great opportunity for people in your area to engage government in something that is meaningful and immediate.
Well, that's very important. And I thank you, Paul, very much. So thank you so much, Paul. And we're going to conclude now. Yes, so we want to thank Paul for joining us for this edition of the St. Paul Learn with the League. Want to thank the League of Women Voters of St. Paul Program Committee for all the work behind the scenes, the League of Women Voters Roseville area, and the League of Women Voters White Bear Lake area, along with SCC and SPPN. And thank you to our attendees for joining us tonight and all your questions. Please be sure to take the survey that will pop up at the end of our presentation. We think the survey is very important for us to plan future programming. And finally, we hope to see you next month on March 29th, Tuesday, for our program on the topic Expanding End-of-Life Options in Minnesota. Our speaker will be Rebecca Thoman of the organization Doctors for Dignity. She will talk with us about her work, including advocacy for passing a bill that is currently right now before the Minnesota legislature. So we hope that you can join us for that. And thank you very much, everyone, and good night to everyone.